to have helped him at all. By contrast, the other character is simply called rich man. Luke's gospel is perhaps the strongest of the four on Jesus' heart for the poor and his warnings to the wealthy. And in many ways, this parable is a narrative enactment of what Jesus said in Luke chapter 6. Blessed are you, happy are you, you're on the right road if you're poor. Not poor in spirit, just poor because God's kingdom is yours. But woe to you, how terrible for you who are rich, because you have already received your comfort. A good deal of us in this room living middle to upper class in an affluent society should rightly be made a bit uncomfortable by this parable and by Jesus' teachings on wealth in Luke's gospel. If we're not troubled, perhaps our hearts have grown hard indeed. We have all walked past Lazarus's. We have all avoided contact. We have all insulated ourselves from people in our community in need. And all of that said, I think there are a great many other identities we could slip in here besides rich man. Lazarus has a name, an identity connected to his creator. Rich man has no name. His identity is rich man. He wears purple cloth every day, not some days, every day. Purple dye was extravagantly expensive. He wants people to see his wealth. He feasts luxuriously every day. Some have suggested that the implication here is every day, including the Sabbath, which means the servants didn't get any rest. But I think Eugene Peterson, again, has a wise caution here. He says, the rich are an easy target in any concern, secular or spiritual, for social reform and economic justice. They furnish endless models for cynical and comical caricature. That possibility is not excluded from the Lazarus story, but given the tenor of Jesus' storytelling, my inclination is to focus elsewhere. In other words, Luke tells us just a few verses earlier that the Pharisees loved money, and so Jesus has told a parable that locates hard-heartedness in wealth, and it's a common cause of hard-heartedness, but it is far from the only cause. So what if Jesus were telling this parable to you? Would he use something different? A certain mother who always wants to seem put together, who always wants her kids to look put together. A certain teacher who always had all the answers. A certain pastor, a certain businesswoman. Of course, the rich man is indicted for failing to use his substantial resources for Lazarus, but it is also about what made him so hard-hearted in the first place. If he were, say, Eliezer, a man with wealth who feared God, he would know that his wealth was something God had given to him to steward. Maybe God had given him the wealth through inheritance. Maybe through parents who instilled in him the value of hard work. Maybe through a mentor who showed him early on shrewd business practices. When we stash our identity in something, whether that's career, wealth, morality, knowledge, insight, parenthood, we more quickly want to take all the credit and we have a possessiveness over it. I did this. Me. I'm amazing. I deserve these things. So what happens after these two men die? We have this chilling scene, and there are three things, I think, to note about it and what it illustrates to us about how we become hard-hearted and unable to see our hard-heartedness. And frankly, it does illustrate something to us about hell and the nature of hell. So those three things are, first, claiming virtue. Second, denial. Third, isolation. Claiming virtue, denial, isolation. So first, claiming virtue. What are the first words out of the rich man's mouth? Father Abraham. Remember who Jesus' audience is, the Pharisees. We are children of Abraham. We are God's chosen ones. God, therefore, is going to deliver us from the wicked pagans, the Romans. Children of Abraham are instructed to care for the vulnerable, to be the means through which God's blessing comes into the world. The rich man has not lived with that DNA at all. But now, when it benefits him, he claims it. Most of us here probably don't consciously claim some kind of ethnic heritage that makes us better in God's eyes, but I would wager that many of us are quick to establish our own virtue. If you're not quite sure what I mean by this, think of the last conflict you had. At work, in marriage, in extended family, or with friends. How quick are we to establish our own rightness, our virtue? And we have different narratives that we go back to. Some of us go quickly to seeing ourselves as the wise and the insightful ones. So people with whom we have conflict, they just don't get it. They're just focusing on the wrong things. They're small-minded, they're crazy, they're emotionally unhealthy. Others of us go quickly to seeing ourselves as victims. So-and-so is a tyrant, they are cold, and they are power-hungry, or they're narcissistic and unfeeling. I had a professor in seminary who told us he was fired from his first ministry job as a youth pastor because his supervisor, the pastor, was controlling and unable to see perspectives different from his own. And then this professor told our class, at least that's what I told my wife. Fortunately, she saw right through it. I was fired because I was bad at youth ministry. Apparently, telling a 13-year-old girl she is being too emotional is something you should not do. And through that, he matured greatly. But you can see how we all spin our narratives. Here's the rich man, literally suffering torment in the afterlife, saying, I'm basically a good person. I'm a child of Abraham. I deserve good things, Abraham. What does he say next? Send Lazarus down to give me a drink. Well, what is this? It's denial. The rich man isn't even trying to get up to where Abraham and Lazarus are. He just wants to get Lazarus down to his level. He's still treating Lazarus like a lowlife, like one of his servants or slaves. You can see an illustration of this with addicts. Okay, things aren't great here, but it's actually not as bad as everyone says. I can handle it. But I do need this person to do this thing for me so that my life will be better. It's living in hell, but denying that you're living in hell, and instead focusing on pulling others down into the fires of torment and chaos with you. Some of us know this all too well. You have struggled or are struggling with addiction, or you have a close loved one who does. An addiction to a substance, to alcohol, to hoarding, to pornography, to debt, and we could go on and on with a huge list of those ways and all the ways that we make our lives hell, and go on to deny that things are really not that bad. But the fact is, all of us, in some ways, are addicts to sin in different ways. Some of us are even addicts to sin in ways that are celebrated by society. We're workaholics or something like that. All of us are guilty of denying that we are the ones who need to change our habits, our perspective. All of us are guilty of looking around at our lives and instead of saying, wow, I've really made a mess of things, we say, if only such and such would get over here and help out, things would get better. And this, of course, leads to isolation. Abraham says to rich man, a great crevasse, a great chasm has been fixed between us and you. Those who wish to cross over from here to you cannot, neither can anyone cross from here to us. I follow C.S. Lewis on this point. Note that the parable does not say, God has fixed a great chasm between us. Now, that is a legitimate reading of this text, so I don't want to dismiss that. Fleming Rutledge says, it is easy for modern people to dismiss altogether this concept of hell as damnation, since our sense of accountability to God as our judge has been weakened to the point of invisibility. But it doesn't tell us who fixed that chasm in place. It could be God. But following C.S. Lewis's line of reasoning, I want to suggest that it is the rich man who has fixed this chasm and not God. Lewis famously said that the doors of hell are locked from the inside. Now again, we are only partly talking about afterlife here. Anyone who has been or loved an addict has seen this. They have locked themselves up in a hell they have created for themselves, and they won't let anyone in who's interested in helping them out, only those who are there to bring them a cup of cool water, to ease their suffering, but not expect any change of them. I don't need to change. My life is fine. It's not perfect, but I'm fine. If you only read one book by C.S. Lewis, you could do a lot worse than The Great Divorce, or Mere Christianity, or Screwtape Letters, or The Chronicles of Narnia, or Paralandra. Okay, there's a lot of good ones. But in The Great Divorce, Lewis imagines a bus ride from hell to the outskirts of heaven, and his picture of hell is this place of isolation, self-created isolation. Isolation from God, of course, but also from one another, because every time you have a conflict with someone, you just move away from them. And so hell is this endless, sprawling suburban metropolis where everyone is living in their dream homes and no one is connected to one another. So, it's Florida. I'm just kidding. But everyone is lonely and bitter and angry, even though they have everything they want. Lewis says this in another spot about how he understands hell. Christianity asserts that we are going to go on forever, and that must either be true or false. Now, there are a good many things that would not be worth bothering about if I were only going to live 80 years or so, but which I had better bother about if I'm going to go on forever. Perhaps my bad temper or jealousy are getting worse, though gradually enough that the increase in my lifetime will not be very noticeable. But it might be absolute hell in a million years. In fact, if Christianity is true, hell is the precise correct technical term for it. Hell begins with a grumbling mood, always complaining, always blaming others, but you are still distinct from it. You may even criticize it in yourself and wish you could stop it, but there may come a day when you can no longer. Then there will be no you left to criticize the mood or even to enjoy it, but just the grumble itself going on forever like a machine. It is not a question of God sending us to hell. In each of us there is something growing which will be hell unless it is nipped in the bud. In the long run, the answer to all those who object to the doctrine of hell is itself a question. What are you asking God to do? To wipe out their past sins at all costs, to give them a fresh start, smoothing every difficulty and offering every miraculous help? But he has done so on Calvary. To forgive them? But they do not seek forgiveness, for they claim to have done nothing egregiously wrong. To leave them alone? Alas, I am afraid that is what, in the end, he does. A great chasm has been fixed. By whom? From which side are the gates of hell locked? And how often do we ask God what he wants to change in us? Or do we only ask God for things in our lives that we think he should change for us? Tyler, I thought you said last week that we are doing Easter sermons in this time, that we're in this 50-day celebratory feast. Christ is risen and all that. And we're doing this dark text? It's not even an Easter text. But of course it is. If they won't listen to Abraham and the prophets, neither will they listen if someone rises from the dead. According to John, the Pharisees and chief priests were so hard-hearted that when they heard about Lazarus coming back from 4 days dead and rotting in the tomb, there was no wonder, no astonishment, no curiosity even, just immediately a plan to kill Jesus. In many ways, it is much easier to go back to life as usual than to deal with the disruption of how you understand reality that a resurrection would cause. When reports begin to emerge from the dejected Jesus community that he has been raised, and the movement begins to spread and grow rapidly, there's no curiosity, no asking, did we get Jesus wrong? Instead, only a swift movement to wipe out these Jesus followers. Now, sure, things in Jerusalem are a bit hellish, but they're not that bad. We're in power a little bit, kind of. It's Jesus who's the problem. This Jesus is bringing resurrection life into the world, but it requires a surrender, a letting go of control. It requires a changing of our hearts and lives. The Pharisees and religious leaders don't want life with angels and in the presence of Father Abraham. That would require them to change. They instead want to find someone who will come down and just bring some relief, some water amidst the flames of their hard-heartedness. Expunge the Romans. They're the problem. Now, once again, we need to be careful not to stand here and point at the Pharisees or at the wealthy, but to ask where it is that we are hard-hearted. Where is it that we are creating hell for ourselves and refusing to acknowledge that that is what we are doing? Where are we so convinced of our own virtue? Again, usually a good place to start to sniff that out is in places of conflict. We're in a general election year. There should be ample opportunity for that. All of us have seen this in witnessing conflicts between two people we love. Have you ever seen this? How sometimes both parties will say they desire reconciliation, but they really just desire the other party to admit massive, significant fault while they admit like teeny, tiny, minor faults. I guess I did say one swear word in our conversation. Reconciliation is less important than preserving their own illusion of virtue, being right. Where are we in denial? Denial that we need to change. Denial that something is wrong. Denial that maybe some of the problems we are facing are of our own making, are clinging too tightly to an identity apart from our Creator. Where are we isolating ourselves from others, refusing to engage hard conversations, refusing to ask difficult questions? Where are we isolating ourselves from God, expecting God to show up when we need Him, but not really submitting to Him? The story of Easter is the story of God's power, of God's new age breaking through, of resurrection life, but it is also the story of human responses to that. Responses of confusion, of doubt, responses of eventual acceptance and repentance and joy and death-proof hope. But it is also the story of hard-heartedness. And once we have considered hell, once we have considered hard-heartedness, Easter takes on an even newer, grander meaning. The cost of Christ's love, the power of Christ's victory. Consider someone in your life who is so entrenched in their ways, so hard-hearted that you feel they will never change. Christ can still reach them. Consider your own hard-heartedness and your own inability to even notice that. Consider the ways we fix chasms that separate us from God and from others. Then hear the lines of the hymn and the lines of the creed. Thy power and thine alone can change the leper's spots and melt the heart of stone. And he descended into hell, into the chasm, into the flames, into the God-forsaken torment we all create for ourselves, into the isolation, into the denial. This is something of what Christ was saying when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me on the cross? It's the descent into hell. Christian art for centuries has depicted something called the harrowing of hell, Christ descending at his death into the pit of God-forsakenness to free those who are apart from God and leading this triumphal procession